What made a woman capable of running a place like Ravensbruck? That question has haunted historians for 8 decades, and it doesn't get any easier to answer the more you learn about the women who patrolled its muddy roll call square, who swung leather whips and wooden clubs at prisoners half-starved and barely able to stand, who selected the sick and the weak for the gas chamber that was built there in the war's final winter. Ravensbrück was the largest concentration camp built specifically for women in the entire Nazi system, and it needed a workforce to run it. That workforce was made up almost entirely of women, ordinary German women recruited from factories, farms and unemployment offices, trained in a matter of weeks to become Aufseherinnen, female overseers, and sent out to inflict a level of cruelty that still defies easy explanation. Some of them became notorious even in their own time, their names whispered by survivors with a mixture of fear and hatred that never faded. Others slipped back into anonymous post-war lives, their pasts buried so deeply that neighbors and even husbands never knew what they had done. In this video, we're going to trace what happened to the female guards of Ravensbrück after the camp was liberated in the spring of 1945. We'll follow them from the chaos of the camp's final days through capture, through the Hamburg trials that tried to reckon with what had happened there, and into the decades that followed, when some faced the gallows, some walked free after a handful of years, and a few simply vanished. So, without further ado, let's start with the woman who built the system in the first place. Johanna Langerfeld arrived at Ravensbrück in the spring of 1939, just weeks after the camp opened its gates for the first time. And she did so with a curious kind of authority that set her apart from almost every other female guard who would follow her. Born in 1900, in the town of Kupferdreh, in what is now part of Essen, Langerfeld had trained as a deaconess and worked in social welfare before the war, and she had briefly been imprisoned herself in the early 1930s on charges connected to an abusive marriage, an experience that gave her a perspective few of her later colleagues shared. When the SS recruited her to help staff the new women's camp, she brought with her a background that was, on paper at least, closer to social work than to soldiering. She was appointed the camp's first Oberaufseherin, its chief wardress, responsible for training the waves of new female guards who would pass through Ravensbrück's gates in the years that followed. Langerfeld's tenure was defined by a strange and uneasy tension. Survivors who encountered her described a woman who could be harsh and who unquestionably enforced the brutal disciplinary structure of the camp, yet who was also remembered, more than almost any other Ravensbrück guard, for occasional acts that ran against the camp's logic of dehumanization. Moments where she intervened to soften a punishment or looked past an infraction that should have brought a beating. This inconsistency would follow her for the rest of her life and would eventually become central to her post-war fate. In 1942, Langerfeld was transferred to Auschwitz to organize the women's camp there, bringing with her the systems and the staff she had trained at Ravensbrück, and it was at Auschwitz that Rudolf Höss and the senior SS command increasingly sidelined her, unhappy with what they saw as her insufficient ruthlessness. She clashed repeatedly with Maria Mandl, who by then had risen through the ranks and would go on to become one of the most feared women in the entire concentration camp system, a story we've told in detail in our video on Mandl's life and crimes. Langerfeld returned to Ravensbrück in 1943, demoted and increasingly marginalized within the camp hierarchy, and by 1945 she had largely faded from a position of real power. But what would become of her once the war ended? When Ravensbrück was overrun by Soviet forces in the final days of April 1945, Langerfeld was captured, and here her story takes its strangest turn. She was interned by Polish authorities and was actually scheduled to stand trial in Krakow alongside other Auschwitz staff, the very people she had once worked alongside and, in some cases, clashed with. While awaiting trial, several former Auschwitz prisoners, women who remembered specific instances of Langerfeld showing them leniency or protecting them from harsher punishment, intervened on her behalf. It was an almost unheard-of turn of events in the history of these post-war reckonings, camp survivors actively working to secure the release of a former SS overseer. In January 1946, largely as a result of this testimony, Langerfeld managed to escape from custody, and she spent the following years living quietly in West Germany under difficult and impoverished circumstances, never formally tried for her role at either camp. She died in 1974 in Augsburg, one of the very few senior Ravensbrück staff members who never faced a courtroom for what had happened under her watch. Her case remains one of the most debated in the history of the camp's administration, a reminder that even within a system built on cruelty, individual conduct could vary and that survivors themselves sometimes held complicated, even contradictory memories of the women who had guarded them. If Langerfeld represented the camp's uneasy, contradictory beginnings, Dorothea Binns represented what Ravensbruck became. Few names provoke as visceral a reaction among survivors of the camp as Binns's. Born in 1920 in the village of Duthenberg, not far from Ravensbruck itself, Binns came from a modest rural background and had almost no education beyond the basics before she applied for work at the newly built camp in 1939, drawn, like so many young women in that period, by the promise of steady wages and the prestige of a uniform. She started as an ordinary guard, but her aptitude for cruelty, and it is difficult to describe it any other way given the surviving testimony, saw her rise quickly through the ranks. By 1943, she had become the camp's chief supervisor, a position of enormous authority over the daily suffering of tens of thousands of women. Survivors describe Binns as someone who did not merely enforce the camp's brutal rules, but who seemed to derive genuine personal satisfaction from inflicting pain. She was closely associated with the camp's notorious bunker, the punishment block where prisoners were subjected to beatings, starvation and isolation, and multiple survivor accounts describe her personally administering floggings, sometimes continuing to beat prisoners well past the point where camp regulations, brutal as they already were, technically permitted. She carried a whip almost constantly and was known to unleash her dog on prisoners for minor infractions. Her relationship with the camp's commandant structure gave her enormous latitude, and she used it. As the war ground toward its conclusion and Ravensbruck's conditions deteriorated catastrophically, with the camp becoming severely overcrowded as prisoners were evacuated westward from camps closer to the advancing Red Army, Binns's brutality reportedly intensified rather than waned. She was present for the construction and operation of the gas chamber that Ravensbruck built in its final months, a facility that claimed thousands of lives in the closing weeks of the war. When the camp was finally evacuated in late April 1945, Binns fled westward, along with much of the remaining SS staff, attempting to blend into the chaos of collapsing Germany. But her escape did not last. British forces captured her in the early summer of 1945, and she was identified relatively quickly given how well known she had become among surviving prisoners who were now able to testify against their former captors. Binns stood trial at the first Hamburg Ravensbruck trial, which opened in December 1946 before a British military tribunal alongside more than a dozen other former camp staff. The testimony against her was overwhelming, survivor after survivor describing specific, sustained acts of violence stretching back years. She offered little in the way of defense, unable to credibly claim ignorance or mere obedience to orders given the sheer volume and specificity of the accounts against her. The tribunal found her guilty and sentenced her to death. On May 2, 1947, Dorothea Binns was hanged at Hameln Prison, one of 13 former Ravensbruck staff executed there in a single dramatic session that British authorities carried out with unusual speed once the sentences were finalised. She was 26 years old. Her case is often cited by historians as one of the starkest illustrations of how quickly an ordinary young woman with limited prospects could be transformed within the machinery of the camp system into one of its most feared enforcers. A transformation that raises uncomfortable questions about the thin line between ordinary cruelty and systemic atrocity that Ravensbruck's structure seemed almost designed to exploit. Not every guard who stood in the dock at Hamburg met the same fate, and few cases illustrate the unpredictability of post-war justice as vividly as that of Carmen Mori. Mori's story stands apart from almost every other figure connected to Ravensbruck because she wasn't originally a guard at all. Born in Bern, Switzerland in 1906 to a well-connected family, Mori had worked as a journalist before the war, and her path to Ravensbruck ran through Nazi Germany's intelligence apparatus rather than its camp administration. She had been recruited, according to some accounts, into work connected to German intelligence services, and after falling out of favour, or possibly after being caught in her own web of deception, she was arrested and sent to Ravensbruck as a prisoner in 1940. It was inside the camp that her transformation occurred. Despite arriving as an inmate, Mori quickly ingratiated herself with the SS staff and was appointed a block senior, a prisoner functionary given authority over her fellow inmates in exchange for privileges and better treatment. It was a position that existed throughout the Nazi camp system, and it created some of the most morally fraught figures in the entire history of the Holocaust, prisoners who wielded genuine power over other prisoners and who, in far too many documented cases, used that power just as brutally as the SS guards who had appointed them. Maury earned a horrifying reputation among her fellow prisoners, who came to know her as the Butcher of Ravensbruck. Survivor testimony described her using her position to torment, beat, and in some accounts contribute to the deaths of women under her supervision within the camp's medical block, where she had gained particular influence. She was also implicated in facilitating some of the camp's most gruesome secrets, including allegations connected to the notorious medical experiments performed on Polish prisoners, women who came to be known among the inmate population as the rabbits, subjected to surgical mutilation in the name of German military medical research. When the war ended, Maury's position was uniquely precarious. She was neither purely a perpetrator in the SS sense, nor purely a victim, and this ambiguity would define her final months. She was arrested and brought before the first Hamburg-Ravensbrück trial in December 1946, alongside Binz and the other senior camp staff, and despite her attempts to reframe her actions as those of a prisoner acting under duress, the tribunal found the evidence of her cruelty too extensive to accept that defense. She was sentenced to death. But Carmen Maury would never hang. In a final act that seemed to fit the theatrical, deceptive pattern of her entire life, she took her own life in her cell at Hameln Prison in April 1947, just hours before her scheduled execution, having somehow smuggled in the means to do so. Her death deprived the British tribunal of the execution they had ordered, and left historians with one final unanswerable question about a woman whose entire wartime story had been built on manipulation, a journalist turned informant, turned camp functionary turned convicted war criminal who escaped the gallows only by choosing her own ending. The medical staff at Ravensbruck occupied a particularly dark corner of the camp's machinery, and few embodied that darkness as completely as Vera Salvaquart. Salvaquart had trained as a nurse before the war, and her path into the camp system came through her work in the medical block, a place that should have represented whatever small mercy the camp allowed, but which, under the SS command structure, became instead an instrument of selection and death. Details of her early life remain sparser than those of some other Ravensbruck staff, but what is well documented is her role inside the camp in its final year, when Ravensbruck, like so many concentration camps in the collapsing Reich, turned increasingly toward outright extermination of prisoners too sick or too weak to be of further use. Survivor and staff testimony from the post-war trials described Salvaquart's direct involvement in poisoning prisoners in the camp's infirmary, administering lethal doses to patients under the guise of medical treatment in cooperation with the camp doctors who oversaw the killing program. She was also connected to the operation of Ravensbruck's gas chamber, constructed in the camp's final winter as the SS scrambled to eliminate prisoners who could no longer work and who Berlin no longer wished to feed. When British forces liberated the area and began rounding up former camp staff, Salvaquart was identified and arrested. She stood trial at the first Hamburg-Ravensbrück proceedings alongside Binz and Maury, and the testimony against her carried a particular horror, precisely because her role as a nurse represented such a grotesque inversion of what that profession was supposed to mean. The tribunal was not swayed by any argument that she had acted under irresistible orders, finding instead that she had participated actively and knowingly in a program of murder disguised as medical care. She was sentenced to death and was among the 13 former Ravensbruck personnel hanged at Hameln Prison on May 2, 1947. Her case, alongside those of the camp doctors and other medical staff implicated in the killing program, remains one of the most chilling chapters in Ravensbruck's history. A reminder that the camp's machinery of death didn't only run through the whips and clubs of guards on the parade ground, but also through the quiet, clinical betrayal of medicine itself. Elizabeth Marshall's role at Ravensbruck placed her at the very centre of the camp's medical apparatus, and her post-war trial would expose just how deeply that apparatus had been corrupted into an instrument of murder. Marshall served as the head nurse of the Ravensbruck Infirmary, a position of genuine authority within the camp's internal hierarchy, and one that came with direct oversight of the medical treatment, or lack of it, given to thousands of sick and injured prisoners over the course of the war. She was significantly older than many of the guards who worked alongside her, having been born in the 1880s, and she brought to the role decades of nursing experience from before the Nazi period, training that made her participation in what followed all the more damning to the tribunal that eventually judged her. Survivor testimony described Marshall as central to the selection process that determined which sick prisoners would be sent to their deaths, rather than treated, working closely with the camp's SS doctors to identify women too weak or too ill to be of further use to the labour system. She was directly implicated in the operation of the camp's euthanasia and gassing program during Ravensbruck's final year, when transports of selected prisoners were sent to their deaths, some to the camp's own newly built gas chamber, and others transported to the Bernburg euthanasia facility further south, part of the wider Nazi program that had begun years earlier with the systematic killing of Germans deemed disabled or mentally ill before expanding to consume camp prisoners as well. When the war ended, Marshall's long career and senior position made her one of the more significant defendants when the first Hamburg-Ravensbrück trial opened in December 1946. The prosecution's case against her rested heavily on the argument that her medical training made her selections a matter of deliberate, informed choice, rather than the kind of blind obedience some lower-ranking guards attempted to claim. The tribunal agreed, finding her guilty of war crimes connected to the systematic killing of sick prisoners. She was sentenced to death and was hanged at Hameln Prison on May 2, 1947, alongside Binz and Salverquart in the same coordinated execution that dispatched 13 former Ravensbruck staff members that morning. Marshall's case remains a particularly stark illustration of how professional expertise, nursing skill that should have been used to save lives, was instead weaponized within the camp system to identify and condemn the weakest prisoners to death. Greta Bosel's involvement in Ravensbruck's killing program placed her alongside Marshall as one of the trial's most significant defendants, though her path into the camp had begun in circumstances that, on the surface, looked almost mundane. Before the war, Bosel had run a small business, and like many of the women recruited into the camp guard system, she came to Ravensbruck seeking steady employment during a period of economic uncertainty. She joined the camp administration and rose to a position with responsibility over the labour allocation of prisoners, a role that put her in direct control over which women were assigned to which work details, a seemingly bureaucratic function that in practice determined who survived the camp's brutal working conditions and who did not. As the war progressed and Ravensbruck's population swelled with prisoners evacuated from camps further east, Bosel's responsibilities expanded into darker territory. She became directly involved in the selection process for the camp's killing program in its final year, helping identify prisoners for transport to death, working in tandem with the medical staff and camp doctors who oversaw the broader machinery of extermination that Ravensbruck had adopted by 1944 and 1945. Survivor testimony at the post-war trial described her as someone who carried out these selections with a coldness that shocked even other camp staff, someone for whom the transition from labour administrator to instrument of the killing program appeared to have required little internal struggle. When British forces began their investigation into Ravensbruck's crimes, Bosel was identified and arrested, and she stood trial at the first Hamburg proceedings in December 1946. Her defence attempted to frame her role as purely administrative, arguing that she had merely processed paperwork rather than personally condemned anyone to death, but the tribunal found this argument unpersuasive given the clear evidence that she had known precisely what those transport lists meant for the women whose names appeared on them. She was convicted and sentenced to death, and on May 2, 1947, she was hanged at Hameln Prison, along with the 12 other Ravensbruck staff executed that day. Her case, like Marshall's, illustrated how the camp's killing program required not just doctors and nurses willing to administer poison, but an entire supporting bureaucracy of selection and transport, ordinary-seeming administrative roles that, at Ravensbruck, became inseparable from murder. But what happened to the guards whose crimes, while still severe, fell short of direct participation in the killing program? Hertha Ehlert's case offers one answer, and it illustrates the wide range of sentences the Hamburg Tribunal handed down, depending on the specific nature and extent of each defendant's actions. Ehlert served as a deputy to Dorothea Binz within the camp's disciplinary structure, and survivor accounts placed her at the scene of numerous beatings and punishments carried out in the camp's punishment block, though her role never reached the same level of singular notoriety that Binz herself achieved. She had joined the camp guard service relatively early in the war and worked her way into a position of genuine authority over the treatment of prisoners held in the bunker, the isolation cells where Ravensbruck's harshest punishments were carried out. When she stood trial at Hamburg in December 1946, the tribunal weighed her culpability against that of the most severe offenders and determined that while she had unquestionably participated in the camp's system of brutality, she had not been shown to have personally selected prisoners for death or to have engaged in the kind of sustained, singular sadism that defined Binz's reputation. She was convicted of war crimes but received a sentence of 15 years imprisonment rather than death, one of several defendants at the first trial whose sentences reflected a rough hierarchy of culpability that the tribunal attempted to construct, even within a system where nearly every defendant had, by any ordinary moral standard, participated in horrific abuse. Eilert served a portion of her sentence before being released in the early 1950s as part of the broader wave of clemency and sentence reductions that swept through occupied and then sovereign West Germany during the period. A wave that saw many convicted camp personnel released years or even decades before their original sentences would have concluded. Little is documented about her life after release, and like many former guards who avoided execution, she appears to have deliberately sought obscurity, settling back into ordinary life under circumstances that left few historical traces, a pattern that would repeat itself again and again among the women who survived the Hamburg trials with prison sentences rather than nooses. Elisabeth Volkenrath's career traced a path that took her from Ravensbruck through some of the most infamous camps in the entire Nazi system, and it would ultimately place her among the most senior female defendants ever tried by the Allies. Volkenrath began her SS career at Ravensbruck, where she trained alongside many of the women who would go on to staff other camps, before being transferred to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where she rose to become the camp's chief supervisor, the most senior female guard position in the entire complex. It was an extraordinary rise for a woman still in her 20s, and it placed her in direct command over the treatment of tens of thousands of female prisoners at the height of the Holocaust's most lethal period, when the gas chambers at Auschwitz were operating at their most murderous capacity. Survivor testimony described Volkenrath as someone who took her disciplinary responsibilities with chilling seriousness, personally involved in selections that sent prisoners to the gas chambers, and known for beatings carried out with a riding crop she carried as a mark of her authority. As Auschwitz was evacuated in the face of the advancing Red Army in January 1945, Volkenrath was transferred again, this time to Bergen-Belsen, where she continued in a senior supervisory role during the camp's catastrophic final months, a period when Bergen-Belsen, never designed as an extermination camp, became a charnel house of disease, starvation, and death, as the collapsing German transport system flooded it with prisoners evacuated from camps further east. When British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen in April 1945, they found conditions of such horror that the images captured there became some of the defining visual evidence of the Holocaust presented to the world. Volkenrath was captured among the camp staff and became one of the defendants at the Belsen trial, a separate but related proceeding to the Ravensbruck trials, held in the autumn of 1945 before her Ravensbruck connections were even fully explored. The evidence against her, spanning her time at 3 different camps and multiple documented instances of direct violence and participation in the selection process, left the tribunal with little room for leniency. She was sentenced to death and was hanged on December 13, 1945, one of the first Ravensbruck-trained guards to face execution, well before Binz, Maury and the others would stand trial at Hamburg the following year. Volkenrath's case, perhaps more than any other, illustrated how the training and culture established at Ravensbruck didn't remain confined to that single camp, but spread outward through the entire concentration camp system. As guards trained, they were redeployed to Auschwitz, to Belsen, and to smaller camps across occupied Europe, carrying with them the brutal methods they had first learned on Ravensbruck's parade ground. Herta Bother's story ran in close parallel to Volkenrath's, another Ravensbruck-trained guard whose career took her through multiple camps before ending at Bergen-Belsen in the war's final catastrophic weeks. Bother had worked as a nurse's aide before the war and joined the camp guard service in 1942, receiving her initial training at Ravensbruck before being transferred to a subcamp and eventually to Bergen-Belsen itself. Survivors who encountered Bother during her time as a guard described her as someone capable of extreme violence, recalling beatings inflicted with clubs and other implements that left prisoners with lasting injuries, and she became known among some survivors by a nickname reflecting the particular savagery of her conduct. When British forces arrived at Bergen-Belsen in April 1945 and began identifying camp personnel among the survivors and the dead, Botha was captured and, like Falkenrath, became a defendant at the Belsen trial that autumn. The tribunal's case against her included specific testimony about beatings that had resulted in serious injury and, in some accounts, contributed to the deaths of prisoners under her supervision. Unlike Falkenrath, however, Botha was not sentenced to death. The tribunal sentenced her instead to 10 years imprisonment, a judgment that reflected the tribunal's attempt to differentiate between the most senior perpetrators who had held command authority and had been responsible for systematic selections, and guards whose brutality, while severe, had not extended to that same level of organizational control over life and death. Botha served several years of her sentence before being released in the early 1950s, and she went on to live a long life under her married name, largely out of public view, until a British journalist tracked her down decades later in the 1990s and confronted her about her wartime conduct in a widely discussed interview that reintroduced her name to a public that had largely forgotten it. She died in 2000, having lived for more than half a century after her release, a stark illustration of the disparity between the swift executions carried out at Hamel in 1945 and 1947 and the long, largely undisturbed post-war lives that a significant number of former Ravensbruck guards were able to build once their prison sentences concluded. Johanna Brach's role at Ravensbruck placed her within the camp's roll call administration, the system responsible for the twice-daily headcounts that became, for thousands of prisoners, one of the most physically punishing aspects of camp life, entirely apart from any deliberate violence. Since prisoners were forced to stand motionless for hours in the open air, regardless of weather conditions, while guards conducted counts that were frequently prolonged deliberately as a form of collective punishment for infractions committed by individual prisoners or entire blocks. Brach was responsible for overseeing significant portions of this roll call process, and survivor testimony describes her as someone who extended these already brutal sessions well beyond what was administratively necessary, using the roll call itself as an instrument of punishment in a manner that killed and permanently injured prisoners through exposure and exhaustion without ever requiring her to lift a whip or a club. This form of institutionalized cruelty, violence achieved through bureaucratic and procedural means rather than direct physical assault, proved harder for the post-war tribunal to prosecute with the same clarity as more overt acts of beating. But investigators nonetheless assembled sufficient testimony connecting Brach to specific documented instances of deliberately extended roll calls that resulted in prisoner deaths. She received a prison sentence when her case was eventually tried, and served her term before disappearing into the same undocumented post-war obscurity that characterized so many of her fellow mid-tier guards. But what about the guards whose names became so notorious that they eclipsed almost every other figure connected to the Nazi camp system? To understand how Ravensbruck functioned as a training ground for the most feared women in the entire Holocaust, we need to look at the young guard who arrived there in 1942 with almost no prior experience of any kind, and who would leave it transformed into one of history's most chilling symbols of cruelty. Irma Gries was just 20 years old when the war ended, but she had already become, by the testimony of survivors and the judgment of the tribunal that eventually tried her, one of the most sadistic individuals to serve anywhere within the Nazi camp system. Born in 1923 in the small town of Richen, Gries came from a modest rural family and left school at 15, drifting through a series of unskilled jobs before applying for work at Ravensbruck in 1942, drawn by the same promise of steady wages and uniformed status that attracted so many young women of her generation into the camp guard service. She received her initial training at Ravensbruck under the same disciplinary culture that had shaped Binz and Volkenrath before her, and it was here that she first developed the reputation for casual, almost theatrical cruelty that would define the rest of her short life. Later that same year, she was transferred to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where she rose with startling speed to become one of the camp's senior female overseers by the age of just 21, placing her in direct command over thousands of prisoners at the height of the Holocaust's most murderous phase. Survivor testimony from Auschwitz described Gries in terms that shocked even the tribunal that eventually judged her. Accounts of prisoners beaten to death, of a guard dog she deployed against inmates, of selections for the gas chamber, carried out with what witnesses described as visible enjoyment rather than grim duty. She cultivated a striking, well-groomed appearance that survivors found particularly disturbing given the context, a woman who took evident pride in her uniform and her power while presiding over almost unimaginable suffering. As Auschwitz was evacuated in January 1945, Grace, like Falkenrath, was transferred first to Ravensbruck briefly and then on to Bergen-Belsen, where she continued her supervisory duties through the camp's catastrophic collapse in the war's final months. When British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen in April 1945, Grace was among the staff captured, and she became one of the most closely watched defendants at the Belsen trial that autumn. Her youth and the sheer volume of testimony against her making her something of a symbol for the proceedings as a whole. The tribunal found her guilty on multiple counts connected to the deaths and mistreatment of prisoners at both Auschwitz and Belsen, and she was sentenced to death. She was hanged on December 13, 1945, the same day as Falkenrath, reportedly walking to the gallows with a composure that further unsettled the British officials present. Greece remains, even 80 years later, one of the most studied and most disturbing figures to emerge from the entire concentration camp system. A woman whose path began with the same basic Ravensbruck training given to thousands of other young women, but who applied it with a ferocity that set her apart even among her most notorious colleagues. Not every guard connected to Ravensbruck's darkest chapter served in the main camp itself, and the story of the Uckermark Youth Camp, a satellite facility attached to Ravensbruck that was repurposed in the war's final year into a dedicated killing site for young female prisoners, produced some of the most disturbing individual cases to emerge from the entire complex. Ruth Neudeck ran Uckermark during this final murderous phase, and her name became synonymous among survivors with a level of institutionalized cruelty that shocked even veterans of the main Ravensbruck camp. Neudeck had transferred into the guard service relatively late in the war, and she was placed in charge of Uckermark at precisely the moment the SS decided to convert the youth camp, originally intended as a kind of corrective facility for young women, into an extermination site for prisoners selected as too weak or too sick to continue working. Survivor testimony described conditions at Uckermark under Neudeck's command as almost unimaginably brutal even by the standards of the wider camp, with systematic starvation, beatings, and direct participation in the killing operations that sent thousands of women to their deaths in the war's final weeks. Some shot, some gassed, some simply left to die of exposure and starvation in the camp's overcrowded barracks. When the war ended, Neudeck was captured and eventually stood trial for her role at Uckermark, and the tribunal, presented with detailed and consistent survivor accounts of her direct involvement in the killing program, found the evidence overwhelming. She was sentenced to death and executed, her case standing as one of the starkest illustrations of how the camp system's final months saw an escalation of violence rather than any softening, as the SS raced to eliminate as many prisoners as possible, even as their own military situation collapsed around them. Margrethe Raab's case at Uckermark offers a different, more legally contested outcome, and it illustrates the genuine difficulty the Hamburg tribunals faced in trying to assign individual culpability within a system of collective, cascading brutality. Raab worked as a nurse at Uckermark during the same period that Neudeck commanded the camp, and she was implicated in the selection and killing process that claimed so many lives there in early 1945. Survivor testimony placed her at the scene of numerous killings, though the specific nature and extent of her personal responsibility, whether she acted as a direct participant or under close supervision from more senior staff, became a matter of extended dispute during her trial. She was convicted and initially sentenced to death alongside several other Uckermark staff, but unlike Neudeck, Raab's sentence was ultimately commuted to a term of imprisonment following an appeal, a relatively rare outcome among the death sentences handed down in the Ravensbruck-related trials. She served a portion of her reduced sentence before being released. And like so many other former guards who avoided execution, she largely disappeared from the historical record afterward, her later life undocumented in any detail that has survived into public accounts. Her case remains frequently cited by historians examining the sometimes inconsistent logic of the post-war tribunals, where two women implicated in strikingly similar conduct at the very same satellite camp could receive dramatically different final outcomes, one facing the gallows and the other eventually walking free. Louisa Dance's career traced yet another version of the well-worn path from Ravensbruck, training into service at Auschwitz and beyond, and her post-war experience would prove to be one of the longest and most closely followed of any former Ravensbruck guard, stretching across nearly 5 decades after the war's end. Dance joined the Camp Guard service in 1943 and, following her initial training, was posted to several camps over the following 2 years, including a period of service connected to Auschwitz's subcamp network, where she was involved in the brutal treatment of prisoners forced into slave labour for German industry. She was known among survivors for beatings carried out with particular viciousness and for her role in the selection processes that determined which prisoners would continue working and which would be marked for death. When the war ended, Dance was captured and initially stood trial in Poland, where post-war tribunals were conducting their own proceedings against camp staff captured within territory that had been liberated by Soviet forces rather than the Western Allies. She was convicted and served a lengthy prison term in Poland before eventually being released and returning to West Germany. But Dance's legal troubles did not end there. In the 1990s, decades after her initial conviction, German prosecutors reopened investigations into her wartime conduct as part of a broader wave of renewed efforts to prosecute aging former camp personnel whose earlier sentences were increasingly viewed, in retrospect, as inadequate given the scale of their crimes. Dance stood trial again in Germany in the 1990s. One of the last former Ravensbruck-trained guards to face judicial proceedings connected to her wartime service, though by then, advanced age and the difficulty of assembling fresh testimony after so many decades complicated the case considerably. She died in the mid-2000s, having lived to see her own crimes revisited by a legal system operating under an entirely different set of assumptions and priorities than the tribunals that had first judged her in the 1940s. A reminder that for some former guards, the reckoning with Ravensbruck's history never fully closed, resurfacing again and again across the following half-century. What became of the guards who occupied more junior positions within Ravensbruck's hierarchy, women who participated in the camp's daily brutality without ever rising to the kind of command authority that defined figures like Binz or Volkenrath? Charlotte Mayhack's case offers one window into this larger, less documented population. Mayhack served as an ordinary guard at Ravensbruck for several years, working the parade grounds and labour details where the camp's daily rhythm of abuse played out largely unremarked by history, since it was the routine, unglamorous violence, the casual beatings and denial of food and medical care, that in aggregate killed and broke far more prisoners than any single dramatic atrocity. She was implicated in specific instances of physical abuse documented by survivor testimony, though her role never rose to the level of prominence that would make her a headline defendant at the Hamburg trials. She was tried in one of the several Ravensbruck-related proceedings held over the following years, receiving a prison sentence considerably shorter than those given to the camp's most senior and most notorious staff. After serving her sentence, she, like Ehlert and so many others convicted of what the tribunals judged to be lesser offences, disappeared into post-war obscurity, her later life essentially undocumented. Her case, unremarkable in isolation, is actually representative of the largest category of former Ravensbruck guards, the hundreds of women who served in the camp over the course of its operation, but who were never individually identified, tried, or held to account at all, simply melting back into German society once the occupation authorities' attention moved on to more prominent targets. The question of how many Ravensbruck guards ultimately escaped any form of legal reckoning entirely is one that continues to trouble historians, and the case of Emma Zimmer illustrates just how porous the post-war justice system could be for guards who kept a low profile. Zimmer served at Ravensbruck during the middle years of the war, working within the camp's labour administration in a role that placed her in regular contact with the forced labour details that sent prisoners out to work in the punishing conditions of nearby armaments factories and agricultural estates, an arrangement that exploited camp labour for the benefit of German industry throughout the war. She was implicated in the harsh treatment of prisoners under her supervision, though the surviving documentation of her specific conduct is considerably thinner than for guards who became defendants in the major Hamburg proceedings. Some accounts suggest she was briefly detained by occupation authorities in 1945 before being released for lack of sufficiently documented evidence to sustain a prosecution, a fate shared by a significant number of former camp staff whose crimes, while real, were difficult to prove to the tribunal's satisfaction in the absence of the kind of overwhelming survivor testimony that had doomed figures like Binns. Zimmer's post-war life, like so many others in this category, went largely unrecorded, and she stands as a representative example of the substantial gap between the scale of Ravensbruck's crimes committed by a guard workforce that numbered in the hundreds over the camp's operational life, and the comparatively small number of women who were ever brought before a court to answer for what happened there. Historians estimate that the various trials connected to Ravensbruck, spanning the Hamburg proceedings and related cases in Poland and elsewhere, accounted for only a fraction of the total guard population, leaving the great majority to return to ordinary life with their pasts never formally examined by any judicial process. Gerda Ganser's time at Ravensbruck placed her among the guards who worked most directly within the camp's punishment system, and her post-war case became one of the notable examples of a defendant who received a comparatively severe sentence without ever facing execution. Ganser worked within the disciplinary structure that Binns oversaw, and survivor testimony described her participation in punishments carried out in the camp's bunker, the isolation block that had become synonymous with some of Ravensbruck's cruelest treatment of prisoners. She was implicated in beatings and in the enforcement of starvation punishments, practices that were technically sanctioned under the camp's own internal regulations, but that were frequently escalated by individual guards well beyond what those regulations specified. When she was tried in connection with the broader Ravensbruck proceedings, the tribunal weighed her conduct against the fuller record of abuse within the punishment block and determined that while she bore genuine responsibility, her role had not extended to the kind of singular, sustained sadism that had defined Binns's own reputation. She received a lengthy prison sentence, one of the longer terms handed down among the defendants who avoided the death penalty, and she served a substantial portion of it before her eventual release in the 1950s. Her post-war life afterward, like the majority of her fellow convicted guards, went largely undocumented. Another name among the dozens who passed through the Hamburg proceedings and then vanished from the historical record once their sentences concluded. Rosa Rice occupied an unusual position within Ravensbruck's hierarchy, having served as a prisoner functionary rather than an SS staff member for much of her time at the camp, a category that, as we saw with Carmen Mori, produced some of the most morally complicated cases to emerge from the entire post-war reckoning. Rice had been imprisoned at Ravensbruck as an inmate before being appointed to a position of authority over other prisoners, a role that came with certain privileges in exchange for enforcing camp discipline among the general prisoner population. Survivor accounts describe a mixed record for Rice, testimony suggesting that she used her position to inflict harsh treatment on fellow prisoners in a manner that mirrored the conduct of the SS guards who had appointed her, though the specific extent of her culpability remained a matter of dispute given the coercive circumstances under which prisoner functionaries operated throughout the Nazi camp system. These roles existed precisely because the SS wanted to offload some of the daily administration of cruelty onto the prisoner population itself, creating a layer of complicity that blurred the line between victim and perpetrator in ways that post-war tribunals struggled to adjudicate fairly. When Rice's case came before the relevant proceedings, the tribunal ultimately handed down a prison sentence that reflected this ambiguity, shorter than those given to the SS staff convicted of similar conduct but still substantial given the documented harm to fellow prisoners under her authority. Her case remains frequently discussed by historians examining the particular moral complexity of the Capo and Block senior system, roles that exposed just how deliberately the SS engineered structures that implicated prisoners themselves in the machinery of the camp's daily brutality. Anna Klein's story reflects yet another common pattern among the women who staffed Ravensbruck, that of a guard whose specific individual conduct proved difficult to document with the same clarity as the camp's most notorious figures, leaving her case something of a footnote within the broader history of the post-war trials. Klein served in the camp's general guard rotation for an extended period during the middle years of the war, working parade ground and barracks supervision duties that placed her in daily contact with the prisoner population, but that generated comparatively less of the kind of specific, dramatic testimony that drove the prosecutions of figures like Binns or Grease. She was named in some survivor accounts as having participated in beatings and in the enforcement of the camp's punishing roll call system, during which prisoners were forced to stand for hours in all weather conditions while guards conducted head counts, a process that itself killed and sickened countless women through exposure and exhaustion, even without any additional violence. Whether Klein was formally tried, and if so, what sentence she received, is less clearly documented than the fates of the more prominent defendants, a gap that is itself revealing of how incompletely the post-war justice process managed to catalogue the full population of women who served at the camp. Her case, like Zimmer's, stands as a reminder of just how many names connected to Ravensbruck's operation remain only partially recorded in the historical record. Guards whose individual culpability was real, but whose specific fates were never fully documented for public history. Margrethe Muse served within the camp's supply and provisioning administration, a role that on its surface appears far removed from the direct violence associated with guards like Binns, but which historians have increasingly recognized as its own form of participation in the camp's lethal machinery. Muse was responsible for aspects of the food distribution system that determined how the already inadequate rations allocated to Ravensbruck's prisoner population were actually divided and delivered, a system that was frequently manipulated by camp staff to further punish specific prisoners or entire blocks through additional withholding of food beyond what official camp policy already specified. Survivor testimony from the post-war period described instances in which food shortages were used as a deliberate tool of control and punishment, and staff connected to the provisioning system, including Muse, were implicated in decisions that worsened already severe malnutrition among the prisoner population. Her case did not generate the same volume of dramatic testimony as the camp's most notorious guards, and when she came before the relevant tribunal proceedings, she received a sentence reflecting a mid-level assessment of her culpability, more severe than the shortest sentences handed down, but well short of a death sentence. She served her term and, like so many others, faded from public documentation once released, her later life essentially untraceable in the historical record. The first Hamburg-Ravensbrück trial, the one that produced the executions of Binns, Marshall, Bossel, Salvequart, and the death sentence that Maury escaped only through suicide, was not the only judicial reckoning connected to the camp. A second Ravensbruck trial followed in 1947, and further related proceedings continued intermittently over the following years as British and, later, West German authorities identified additional former staff members living within their jurisdiction. These subsequent trials tended to involve guards whose roles had been less central to the camp's most infamous atrocities, and the sentences handed down reflected that, skewing toward prison terms rather than the death penalty that had characterized the first trial's most severe outcomes. But even these lesser proceedings faced enormous practical obstacles. Witnesses who had survived Ravensbrück were scattered across Europe and beyond, many struggling to rebuild their own shattered lives and reluctant, understandably, to relive their trauma in a courtroom setting. Evidence had to be gathered largely from survivor testimony rather than the kind of paper trail that would later prove so damning in trials connected to more bureaucratically documented aspects of the Holocaust, since the day-to-day violence of a place like Ravensbrück left few written records of the kind that historians would later rely on to reconstruct the camp's operation in detail. Occupation authorities, moreover, had limited resources and competing priorities, juggling the Ravensbrück proceedings against the much larger effort to prosecute senior Nazi leadership at Nuremberg and against the practical work of administering occupied Germany itself. All of this meant that the reach of post-war justice, however historically significant the trials that did take place, never came close to capturing the full population of women who had served as guards at Ravensbrück over its 6 years of operation. Estimates suggest that thousands of women worked as Aufseherinnen across the entire Nazi camp system during the war, the vast majority trained at Ravensbrück before being posted elsewhere, and only a small fraction of that total number were ever formally tried for their conduct. How then did so many former guards manage to simply disappear back into ordinary German life? Part of the answer lies in the sheer chaos of Germany's collapse in 1945, when identity documents were destroyed, records were lost, and millions of people were displaced across a landscape overwhelmed by refugees, returning soldiers, and the general disintegration of civil administration. A guard who discarded her uniform adopted a maiden name or a married name that obscured her wartime service, and relocated to a different region of Germany could often avoid detection entirely, particularly once Allied attention shifted, by the late 1940s, away from lower-level camp personnel and toward the practical challenges of rebuilding West Germany as a Cold War ally. Survivor testimony remained the primary tool for identifying former guards in the years immediately after the war, and that testimony depended heavily on individual survivors recognizing individual faces, a system that inevitably left countless perpetrators unidentified simply because no surviving witness happened to encounter them again or come forward with specific accusations. It is a sobering thought, and one that historians of Ravensbruck return to again and again, that many of the men and women most directly responsible for the suffering inflicted there lived out ordinary, undisturbed lives in the decades that followed, their neighbours, and in some documented cases even their own children, entirely unaware of what they had done during the war. Ella Weber's case illustrates the particular vulnerability of women who had trained at Ravensbruck, but who served most of their time in the camp's satellite network. Subcamps that were established across the wider region as Ravensbruck's central administration expanded its reach into local labour projects tied to German war production. Weber trained at the main camp before being posted to one of these subcamps, where she oversaw prisoners forced to work in conditions that, while distinct from the central camp's own particular horrors, carried their own significant death toll through exhaustion, malnutrition, and industrial accidents that camp administrators did little to prevent. Survivor accounts from the subcamp network are generally less extensively documented than those from Ravensbruck's main compound, a gap that reflects both the smaller number of prisoners who passed through any individual subcamp and the practical difficulties survivors faced in tracking down specific guards once the war ended and the subcamp network itself had been dissolved and its records scattered or destroyed. Weber was investigated in connection with her subcamp service, but the surviving record of any formal trial outcome for her specific case is thin. Another example of how the sprawling, decentralized nature of the Ravensbruck system, a main camp supported by dozens of satellite facilities, scattered across the region, made comprehensive post-war accountability an almost impossible task for occupation authorities working with limited time and resources. Gerda Quernheim commanded attention within the post-war proceedings for a role that combined elements of both the central camp's disciplinary structure and its labour administration, illustrating how fluid the boundaries between different categories of guard duty could be within Ravensbruck's operation. Quernheim moved between assignments over the course of her service, spending time both on general parade ground supervision and within the labour allocation system that determined prisoner work assignments, giving her a broader first-hand familiarity with the camp's overall machinery than guards who remained fixed in a single role throughout their service. Survivor testimony connected her to specific instances of physical punishment, as well as to decisions about work assignments that, given the brutal conditions of certain labour details, particularly those involving outdoor construction work in the harsh winters that afflicted the region north of Berlin where Ravensbruck was located, effectively functioned as a form of slow execution for prisoners deemed expendable or troublesome. When her case reached the tribunal, the combination of disciplinary and administrative culpability resulted in a substantial prison sentence, reflecting the view that her breadth of involvement across multiple aspects of the camp's operation made her more culpable than guards whose participation had been confined to a single, narrower role. She served her sentence and was released in the early to mid-1950s, after which, in keeping with the pattern that defined so many of her former colleagues, she disappears from the historical record, her later decades unaccounted for in any documentation that has come to light. Gertrude Rabestein's assignment placed her within the camp's clothing depot, and the grim sorting operations connected to it, work that brought her into direct contact with the systematic processing of belongings taken from prisoners who had been killed within the camp's final months, a task that required guards to handle, catalogue and prepare for shipment, the clothing and personal effects of women who had, in many cases, been murdered only hours or days earlier. Survivor testimony describes the psychological toll this work exacted even on the guards assigned to it, though such observations did nothing to diminish the tribunal's assessment of individual culpability when guards like Rabestein were also documented as having participated in more direct forms of abuse during their broader service at the camp. She was tried alongside other mid-tier defendants and received a prison sentence reflecting a moderate assessment of her overall conduct. one that acknowledged both her participation in this disturbing administrative function and the more direct instances of physical punishment that survivor accounts connected to her. Ilse Forster's brief period of service at Ravensbruck, cut short when she was reassigned to a different camp entirely in the war's final year, nonetheless generated enough documented testimony to result in formal prosecution once occupation authorities began the work of identifying former camp personnel. Forster had worked primarily within the camp's general guard rotation, and while her file lacks the extensive documentation associated with the camp's most notorious figures, survivor accounts placed her at specific instances of punishment carried out against prisoners in her charge. Her subsequent trial produced a prison sentence toward the shorter end of those handed down across the various Ravensbruck-related proceedings, reflecting both the relatively brief duration of her documented service and the comparatively narrower body of testimony available to prosecutors by the time her case was actually examined. What connects all of these individual stories, the executed and the imprisoned, the ones who escaped justice and the ones who eventually faced it decades later, is the uncomfortable reality that Ravensbruck's guard workforce was drawn overwhelmingly from ordinary German women. Not ideological fanatics selected for their extremism, but working-class and lower-middle-class women recruited through conventional employment channels. Women who might otherwise have spent the war years in a factory or on a farm. That the camp system could take such a broad cross-section of German womanhood and, through a combination of training, peer pressure, institutional culture, and the sheer moral vacuum created by total war, transform a meaningful percentage of them into willing participants in systematic cruelty and murder remains one of the most disturbing and most studied phenomena to emerge from the entire history of the Holocaust. It is a pattern historians have returned to again and again, not to excuse what these women did, but to understand how ordinary institutional structures, uniforms, hierarchies, promotion incentives, and the psychological distance created by treating prisoners as subhuman could produce such a consistent record of brutality across so many hundreds of individual women who might never have been capable of such acts under any other circumstances. The commandants who oversaw Ravensbruck throughout its operation sat above even the most senior guards in the camp's chain of command. And while this video focuses primarily on the female overseers who carried out the daily brutality, understanding what happened to the men who directed them helps explain the broader structure of accountability, or the lack of it, that shaped the post-war proceedings. Fritz Sören served as Ravensbruck's final commandant, overseeing the camp during its most lethal period in 1944 and 1945, when the gas chamber was constructed and the killing program at Uckermark and elsewhere reached its peak intensity. Sören fled westward as the camp was evacuated, and in a pattern that would repeat itself among senior SS officials across occupied Germany, attempted to disappear using false identity papers, working for a period under an assumed name before French occupation authorities eventually identified and captured him. He stood trial before a French military tribunal, since the territory where he was ultimately located fell within the French occupation zone, and the proceedings examined his overall responsibility for the camp's administration, including the killing program that had operated under his direct authority. He was found guilty and executed in 1950, one of the last senior Ravensbruck officials to face capital punishment, his trial coming years after the main Hamburg proceedings had already concluded, and by which point Allied appetite for pursuing additional war crimes prosecutions had noticeably diminished as Cold War priorities increasingly reshaped the occupation's overall approach to Germany. Johann Schwarzhuber occupied a position that bridged the male SS command structure and the female guard hierarchy, serving as the camp's protective custody camp leader, a role with direct authority over the guards, including Binz and her colleagues, who carried out the daily disciplinary regime. Schwarzhuber had previously served at Auschwitz before his transfer to Ravensbruck, bringing with him experience from a camp that had already perfected the machinery of mass killing, and survivor testimony connected him directly to the operation of Ravensbruck's gas chamber and to the broader killing program in the camp's final months. He was captured after the war and stood trial at the first Hamburg-Ravensbruck proceedings alongside Binz, Maury, Marshall, Bussel and Salvequart, the same trial that produced the mass execution at Hamelin in May 1947. The tribunal found him guilty of war crimes connected to his command role over the killing operations, and he was sentenced to death and executed alongside the female defendants convicted in that same proceeding. A reminder that the accountability process, however incomplete, did extend to the senior male officials who had established the framework within which guards like Binns operated, even as so many further down the chain of command escaped any formal reckoning at all. Percival Triter represents one of the most contested cases connected to Ravensbruck's medical apparatus, a camp doctor whose trial produced a controversial outcome that historians continue to debate. Triter served as a physician at Ravensbruck and was implicated in the selection process that sent sick and injured prisoners to their deaths, as well as in medical decisions that survivor testimony described as contributing directly to preventable deaths among the prisoner population under his supposed care. He stood trial at the first Hamburg proceedings, and unlike Schwarzhuber, he was not sentenced to death, receiving instead a sentence that some survivors, and later historians, viewed as disproportionately lenient given the scope of his documented involvement in the camp's killing program. Treit did not serve out his sentence. He took his own life in his cell shortly after the verdict was announced, joining Carmen Mori as one of the defendants connected to the Ravensbrück trials, whose case ended in suicide rather than either execution or completed imprisonment, a pattern that recurred often enough among convicted Nazi camp personnel to become its own small subplot within the broader history of the post-war reckoning, as men and women who had spent years enforcing a system of death ultimately chose to end their own lives rather than face either the gallows or the slow reckoning of a prison sentence. Returning to the female guard population itself, the case of Christel Jankowski offers another window into the mid-tier of Ravensbruck's disciplinary structure, guards whose conduct was severe enough to generate survivor testimony and formal prosecution, but who never rose to the level of command authority that defined the camp's most notorious figures. Jankowski served in the General Guard rotation for an extended period, and survivor accounts describe her involvement in the enforcement of the camp's punishing labour quotas, a system under which prisoners assigned to certain work details, including brutal outdoor construction projects and munitions work in nearby factories, were required to meet production targets that were frequently impossible to achieve, given the starvation rations and lack of proper equipment the camp provided. Guards responsible for enforcing these quotas were known to inflict punishment on prisoners who fell short, regardless of whether the shortfall reflected genuine malingering or simply the physical impossibility of the assigned task given the prisoner's weakened condition. Jankowski was implicated in specific instances of this kind of punishment, and when her case came before the relevant tribunal, she received a prison sentence in the middle range of those handed down across the various Ravensbrück-related proceedings. She served her term and was released in the 1950s. Her subsequent life, like so many others in this broad middle tier of former guards, essentially undocumented in any source that has survived into the historical record available today. The question of what drove so many young German women to volunteer for guard duty at a place like Ravensbrück in the first place has occupied historians for decades, and the recruitment patterns that emerge from surviving records paint a picture considerably more mundane than the popular imagination might expect. Advertisements placed in local newspapers and through regional labour offices during the war years describe the positions in strikingly bureaucratic terms: opportunities for steady employment with the SS administration, decent wages by wartime standards, and housing provided as part of the compensation package. For women from working class or rural backgrounds, particularly those facing limited employment prospects, as the German economy increasingly prioritised war production over civilian industries that had traditionally employed women, the positions offered genuine practical appeal, entirely apart from any ideological commitment to Nazi racial doctrine. Training for new recruits typically lasted only a matter of weeks, conducted at Ravensbrück itself before assignment either to the main camp or to one of the growing network of satellite facilities and other camps across the expanding Nazi system. This brief, practically focused training period stood in sharp contrast to the years of ideological indoctrination that shaped many male SS personnel, and it has led some historians to argue that the transformation of these recruits into willing participants in systematic cruelty happened less through explicit ideological conversion than through a more insidious process of institutional acclimatization. The gradual normalization of violence that occurred simply through daily immersion in a system where brutality was the unremarkable expected norm reinforced by peer example, by promotion incentives that rewarded strict discipline, and by the psychological distancing that came from viewing prisoners as fundamentally subhuman, a distancing the Nazi state had spent years cultivating through propaganda well before any individual guard ever set foot inside the camp gates. Charlotte Kleiman's brief but well-documented tenure at Ravensbruck illustrates another common pattern among the camp's guard population, that of women who served for a relatively short period, sometimes less than a year, before being transferred elsewhere or, in some cases, before the war's end interrupted their service entirely. Kleiman joined the Guard service in the final full year of the war, a period when Ravensbruck's population had swollen dramatically due to the evacuation of prisoners from camps closer to the advancing Soviet front, creating severe overcrowding and correspondingly harsher conditions that new guards were thrust into with minimal preparation. Survivor testimony from this chaotic final period describes conditions of such severity: overcrowded barracks, catastrophic food shortages, and rampant disease, that distinguishing individual guard culpability from the broader systemic collapse, the camp experienced in its final months became genuinely difficult for post-war investigators to establish with precision. Kleiman was implicated in specific incidents of abuse during this final period, though the relatively short duration of her service compared to guards who had been present for years meant her case generated a correspondingly smaller body of testimony. She received a prison sentence when her case was eventually adjudicated, and like so many others convicted of lesser offences, her post-war life beyond her release remains largely unrecorded. One more name among the substantial population of former guards whose individual stories trail off into historical silence once their formal legal proceedings concluded. What made the final months of Ravensbruck's operation so uniquely lethal, and why did the guard population's conduct during this period, from Neudeck at Uckermark to Kleiman in the main camp, become the focus of so much of the post-war prosecutorial effort? The answer lies substantially in the collapse of the broader German war effort and the corresponding shift in SS policy toward the camp system as a whole. As the Red Army advanced from the east through the winter of 1944 and into 1945, camps located in occupied Poland and further east, including Auschwitz itself, were evacuated, with tens of thousands of prisoners forced onto brutal death marches westward, many of whom ended up, those who survived the marches at all, crowded into camps like Ravensbruck that had never been designed to hold anywhere near the numbers suddenly arriving at their gates. This catastrophic overcrowding coincided with a broader SS policy shift, as senior Nazi leadership, recognizing that the war was lost but determined to continue murdering as many prisoners as possible before Allied forces could intervene, authorized the construction of new killing facilities, including Ravensbruck's own gas chamber, built and put into operation only in the camp's final winter, arguably the single most concentrated period of deliberate killing in the camp's entire six-year history, compressed into just a few months as the war raced toward its conclusion. This is the context that explains why guards who served primarily during this final period, individuals like Neudeck and the wider Uckermark staff, generated some of the most severe individual culpability findings among the entire Ravensbruck guard population, despite in some cases having served for a comparatively short overall duration, because the sheer intensity and deliberateness of the killing during those final months left less room for any claim of passive or merely bureaucratic participation. Elfriede Rauch's case connects Ravensbruck to yet another dimension of the camp's operation, the network of forced labour arrangements that tied the camp directly into German industrial production for the war effort. Rauch supervised prisoners assigned to work for Siemens, one of several major German companies that established production facilities directly adjacent to Ravensbruck, specifically to exploit the camp's prisoner labour force. A business arrangement that made concentration camp administration and private German industry direct commercial partners in a system that treated human lives as a disposable input to wartime manufacturing. Survivor testimony from women who worked in these Siemens facilities describes brutal conditions, inadequate safety measures, and guards, including Rauch, who enforced production quotas through physical punishment, regardless of the exhaustion and malnutrition that made those quotas nearly impossible to sustain over any extended period. Rauch was identified after the war and faced prosecution connected specifically to her role in the industrial labour supervision. A somewhat different category of case than those focused purely on the camp's internal disciplinary or medical apparatus, since it raised additional questions about corporate complicity that the post-war tribunals were only partially equipped to address, given that their mandate focused primarily on individual guard conduct rather than the broader question of corporate responsibility, a question that would only be more fully addressed in later decades through separate historical and legal reckonings with companies like Siemens over their wartime use of camp labor. She received a prison sentence for her role and, following its completion, faded from public documentation in the familiar patterns shared by so many of her former colleagues. Ilse Goering worked within Ravensbruck's clothing and property administration, a role connected to the systematic confiscation of prisoners' belongings upon their arrival at the camp, part of the broader machinery of dispossession that operated at every Nazi camp and that extended, in the case of murdered prisoners, to the confiscation and redistribution of their personal effects, hair, and in the most notorious documented instances, in some camps, even material extracted from their bodies. Goering's specific role placed her in a position of relatively limited direct physical contact with prisoners compared to guards working the parade grounds or punishment blocks, but her participation in the systematic stripping of prisoners' identities and possessions was itself recognized by post-war investigators as a meaningful component of the camp's broader dehumanization process, the deliberate stripping away of every marker of individual identity that prisoners possessed upon arrival, from their clothing to their hair to, eventually for those selected for death, their very names, replaced by tattooed or recorded prisoner numbers. When Goering's case was examined, the tribunal handed down a comparatively lighter sentence than those given to guards with documented histories of direct physical violence, reflecting the tribunal's general approach of calibrating punishment to the specific, provable nature of each defendant's conduct, rather than treating all camp staff as uniformly culpable regardless of their particular role. She completed her sentence and, like so many others, disappeared from public record thereafter. The role of camp overseers in the transport and evacuation process during Ravensbruck's final weeks produced its own category of documented cruelty, distinct from the killing program itself but connected to it through the sheer lethality of the conditions under which evacuations were carried out. As Soviet forces closed in during April 1945, the SS ordered a partial evacuation of Ravensbruck's remaining prisoner population, forcing thousands of women on a brutal march westward under guard. A death march in every sense of the term, during which prisoners too weak to continue were shot or simply left to die along the roadside, while guards pressed the remaining marchers onward toward camps and processing points further west that were themselves rapidly disintegrating under the pressure of the collapsing German war effort. Survivor accounts of this final evacuation identify specific guards who carried out shootings of stragglers during the march, though the chaotic circumstances of the retreat meant that many individual perpetrators were never definitively identified or connected to specific killings with the kind of evidentiary certainty the post-war tribunals required for conviction. This final chapter of Ravensbruck's operational history, playing out even as the camp that remained behind was liberated by advancing Soviet troops on April 30, 1945, represents one of the least prosecuted aspects of the entire Ravensbruck story. Precisely because it occurred during a period of such extreme chaos and dispersal that reconstructing individual accountability afterward proved exceptionally difficult, leaving an unknown number of guards responsible for these final death march killings entirely unaccounted for in the historical and legal record. What happened to the small number of women who managed to avoid capture entirely in the immediate post-war period, disappearing before occupation authorities or Soviet forces could identify and detain them? The historical record of successful long-term evasion is inherently difficult to document, since by definition, the women who succeeded left few traces for historians to follow, but scattered evidence from later decades, including the occasional case that resurfaced through chance recognition by a survivor decades after the war, suggests that a meaningful number of former guards did successfully build entirely new identities in the chaotic conditions of post-war Germany, sometimes remaining within the country under altered names and sometimes emigrating entirely, following pathways to South America or elsewhere that, while far better documented for senior male SS officials who fled along the so-called rat lines, a story we've covered in detail in our video on the Nazi escape networks through Argentina, were occasionally used by female camp staff as well, particularly those with family connections or resources that made international relocation feasible. The overwhelming majority of these cases, precisely because they succeeded, left no trial record, no survivor testimony that ever reached a courtroom, and no definitive documentation of what became of the women involved, leaving historians to rely on fragmentary evidence, occasional post-war sightings reported by survivors that were never formally investigated, and the simple demographic reality that the number of women trained as Ravensbruck guards over the camp's 6 years of operation vastly exceeded the number who were ever tried, implying that a substantial population of former perpetrators lived out full lives, in many cases decades longer than any of their victims were permitted to live, entirely beyond the reach of justice. Maria Mandel's own career began at Ravensbruck before she rose to become one of the single most feared women in the entire history of the Holocaust, and while we've covered her full story in exhaustive detail in our dedicated video on her life and crimes, her early years illustrate perfectly how the camp functioned as the training ground for the entire female guard system. Mandel joined the Ravensbruck Guard Service in 1938, among the very first cohort of women recruited when the camp opened, and her rapid rise there, marked out early by superiors as an unusually capable and disciplined enforcer, set the pattern for the transfer system that would later carry her, along with figures like Falkenrath and Grieser, to Auschwitz, where she would go on to oversee the selection of untold thousands of women and children for the gas chambers as the camp's senior female overseer. Her clashes with Johanna Langefeld, discussed earlier in this video, reflected a broader tension within the camp system between the small minority of guards who retained some vestige of restraint and the growing number who, like Mandel, embraced the escalating brutality that senior SS leadership increasingly rewarded with promotion and authority. Mandel was eventually captured by American forces in 1945 and extradited to Poland, where she stood trial and was executed in 1948 for her role in the deaths of untold numbers of Auschwitz prisoners, a sentence handed down by a Polish tribunal operating independently of the Hamburg proceedings that judged most of her former Ravensbruck colleagues. If you want the complete account of her rise from Ravensbruck recruit to one of the most notorious women of the entire war, our full documentary on her life covers it in depth. The legal framework under which the Hamburg tribunals operated deserves some explanation, since it shaped every verdict discussed throughout this video and explains some of the apparent inconsistencies between sentences handed down for seemingly comparable conduct. The trials were conducted under British military law, applying charges connected to violations of the laws and customs of war, rather than the more expansive charges of crimes against humanity that were being developed simultaneously at the much larger Nuremberg proceedings against senior Nazi leadership. This meant that Ravensbruck defendants were judged primarily on the basis of documented individual acts of violence or direct participation in killing, established through survivor testimony and any surviving camp documentation that investigators could locate, rather than on a broader theory of collective responsibility for having served within a criminal organization. This individual, act-based standard explains why guards like Ehlert, Botha and Rice, whose documented conduct, however brutal, fell short of direct participation in killing, received prison sentences rather than death, while Binz, Salviquart, Marshall and Bosel, against whom the prosecution could establish direct involvement in specific killings or in the systematic killing program, faced the gallows. It also explains the fundamental unevenness of the entire process, since the standard inherently favoured defendants whose crimes had, by chance or by role, generated less specific documentable testimony, regardless of the broader moral weight of the system they had all served within. The role of memory and commemoration at the Ravensbruck site itself, which today functions as a memorial and museum in Germany, has evolved considerably since the immediate post-war decades, and understanding that evolution helps explain why so much additional research into individual guard cases has continued right up into the present day. In the immediate aftermath of the war, East Germany, within whose territory the camp fell after the country's division, developed a memorial narrative that emphasized the camp's role in the persecution of political prisoners and the broader anti-fascist resistance, a framing that reflected the East German state's own ideological priorities during the Cold War period, and that gave comparatively less attention to the specific experiences of Jewish prisoners, or to the detailed individual culpability of guards like those profiled throughout this video. It was only after German reunification in 1990 that the Ravensbruck Memorial Site underwent a substantial reworking of its historical presentation, incorporating decades of additional survivor testimony, newly accessible archival material from former East German and Soviet records, and a more comprehensive account of the camp's full range of victims and perpetrators alike. This reworking coincided with, and helped drive, the renewed prosecutorial efforts of the 1990s and early 2000s that saw cases like Louise Danz's revisited by German courts operating under a legal and historical understanding considerably more developed than what had been available to the original Hamburg tribunals working in the immediate, chaotic aftermath of the war. This ongoing process of historical reassessment means that our understanding of exactly what happened to Ravensbruck's guard population and how thoroughly or how inadequately justice was ultimately served continues to be refined even 8 decades after the camp's liberation, as historians work through archival material that in some cases remained inaccessible behind the Iron Curtain for nearly half a century after the war's end. Frieda Wolf's case, one of the later prosecutions connected to the broader Ravensbruck reckoning, illustrates how the pursuit of individual guards continued in fits and starts for decades after the main Hamburg proceedings had concluded, driven forward whenever new evidence or witness testimony happened to surface. Wolf had served at Ravensbruck during the war's middle years before relocating, following her release from a relatively brief period of post-war internment, during which insufficient evidence existed to bring formal charges to a quiet town in West Germany where she lived for years under her married name without attracting any particular attention. Her case resurfaced decades later when a survivor, participating in one of the oral history projects that gained momentum from the 1980s onward, as aging survivors increasingly felt the urgency of recording their testimony before it was lost entirely, identified Wolf by name, and provided specific, detailed testimony about incidents of abuse that had not been part of the original post-war investigation. West German prosecutors reopened the case, and Wolf, by then elderly, faced renewed legal proceedings that ultimately produced a conviction, though the sentence handed down reflected both her advanced age and the practical difficulties of prosecuting decades-old crimes with a diminished pool of surviving witnesses and physical evidence. Her case, alongside Danz's, represents a distinct final wave of Ravensbruck-related prosecutions. Cases that only became possible because of the patient, decades-long work of survivors and historians determined to ensure that the passage of time would not allow the camp's perpetrators to escape all accountability simply by outliving the initial post-war window during which most prosecutions had taken place. It is also worth noting how the specific timing of each guard's arrival at Ravensbruck shaped the nature of the crimes they were later tried for, since the camp itself changed enormously across its 6 years of operation. A guard who served primarily in 1939 or 1940 during the camp's early years encountered a very different institution than one who arrived in the war's final catastrophic months when overcrowding, the killing program, and the death marches had transformed Ravensbruck into something considerably more lethal than its original design had contemplated. This chronological dimension helps explain why guards like Langefeld, whose service was concentrated in the camp's earlier years, generated a more mixed historical record than guards like Neudeck, whose brief tenure coincided precisely with the camp's most murderous final phase, a reminder that timing, as much as individual disposition, shaped the specific character of the crimes each woman ultimately came to be associated with. The international composition of Ravensbruck's prisoner population meant that the post-war trials drew witnesses and continued interest from across Europe long after the immediate British occupation authorities had turned their attention elsewhere, and this international dimension shaped the trial's legacy in ways worth noting before we turn to several further individual cases. French, Polish, and Soviet observers all maintained interest in the proceedings given the substantial numbers of their own citizens who had been imprisoned at the camp, and in several instances, survivors from these countries travelled specifically to give testimony at Hamburg, despite the considerable practical difficulties of post-war European travel. a testament to how important these women considered the process of formal accountability, even amid their own efforts to rebuild shattered lives. Polish survivors in particular played an outsized role in identifying and testifying against former guards, reflecting the fact that a substantial proportion of Ravensbruck's total prisoner population over the course of the war had been drawn from occupied Poland, including many of the young women subjected to the notorious medical experiments that Carmen Mori had been implicated in facilitating. This international pressure and ongoing attention helped ensure that the Hamburg proceedings, whatever their ultimate limitations in capturing the full scope of Ravensbruck's guard population, at least addressed the camp's most senior and most notorious perpetrators with a rigor that reflected genuine, sustained international scrutiny rather than a hastily assembled and quickly abandoned occupation formality. Erika Kolmer's path into the Ravensbruck guard system began, like so many others profiled in this video, through the practical necessity of wartime employment rather than any documented history of prior ideological extremism. And her case adds further texture to our understanding of the camp's punishment block, the site of so much of the violence this video has already traced through the stories of Binz and her deputies. Kolmer worked within the bunker's rotation of guards responsible for administering the corporal punishment that the camp's own internal regulations technically sanctioned. Floggings carried out according to a nominal set of rules, specifying maximum blow counts and requiring a doctor's presence, rules that survivor testimony makes clear were violated as a matter of routine rather than exception. Kolmer was specifically named by multiple survivors as having exceeded the sanctioned punishment limits on numerous documented occasions, continuing to strike prisoners well beyond the point where camp regulations required the punishment to stop, and in several accounts continuing even after the prisoner being punished had lost consciousness. When her case reached the tribunal, this pattern of documented repeated excess proved damaging to any defense built around the claim that she had merely been enforcing officially sanctioned camp discipline, since the evidence showed a persistent willingness to exceed even the already brutal official limits. She received a substantial prison sentence, among the longer terms handed down to defendants who avoided execution, and served the bulk of it before release in the mid-1950s, after which her subsequent life goes undocumented in the historical record, following the pattern established by so many of her fellow convicted guards. Frieda Brandt's role connected Ravensbruck's central administration to the fate of specific vulnerable populations within the camp, particularly the smaller number of pregnant women and mothers with infant children who passed through Ravensbruck at various points during the war, a population whose treatment reveals some of the camp's most disturbing institutional practices. Brandt was implicated in the administration of the camp's so-called nursery, a facility that existed nominally to care for infants born to prisoners, but which survivor testimony describes as a site of shocking neglect, with documented cases of infants dying from malnutrition, exposure, and lack of basic medical care at rates that left little doubt the facility functioned, whatever its nominal purpose, as another component of the camp's broader machinery of death, rather than any genuine effort at infant welfare. Brandt's specific responsibilities within this system and the documented testimony connecting her to decisions that resulted in infant deaths formed the basis of a prosecution that the tribunal treated with particular gravity given the vulnerability of the victims involved. She received a significant prison sentence, and her case remains one of the most difficult and disturbing chapters within the broader history of Ravensbruck's crimes, a reminder that the camp's lethal indifference extended even to the youngest and most helpless prisoners who passed through its gates. Clara Opitz worked as a guard specifically assigned to the transport details that moved prisoners between Ravensbrück and its network of satellite labor camps, a role that placed her in direct control over prisoners during some of the most physically dangerous moments of their captivity. The transit periods when prisoners were most vulnerable to violence, exposure, and exhaustion, packed into inadequate transport with minimal food, water, or opportunity for rest. Survivor accounts of these transport details describe guards, including Opitz, who enforced order through beatings and who showed little concern for prisoners who collapsed or fell ill during the journeys, treating such prisoners as an administrative inconvenience rather than a medical emergency requiring any kind of intervention. When Opitz's case was examined by post-war investigators, testimony connected her to specific documented incidents during these transports, and she received a prison sentence commensurate with the tribunal's assessment of her documented conduct, a term she served before fading, once again, into the largely undocumented post-war population of former guards whose later lives left few traces for historians to follow. Taken together, the Hamburg trials and their various successor proceedings convicted several dozen former Ravensbruck personnel, of whom a substantial cluster, including Binz, Marschall, Bussel, Salvequart, Volkenrath, Graeser, Neudeck, Suren, and Schwarzhuber, faced execution, while a larger number, including Ehlert, Boothi, Dance, Rabe, Ganser, Rice, and many others whose names have faded further from public memory, served prison sentences ranging from several years to over a decade before eventual release. Set against this figure, historians estimate that Ravensbruck employed somewhere in the range of several thousand female guards over the course of its operation between 1939 and 1945, a number that makes unmistakably clear just how partial and incomplete the post-war accountability process ultimately proved to be, even accounting for the genuine dedication and effort that British investigators and prosecutors brought to the trials they were able to mount in the difficult, resource-strapped years immediately following the war. The question of intergenerational reckoning, how the children and grandchildren of former Ravensbruck guards have processed their family histories once the truth eventually came to light, adds a further layer to this story that extends well beyond the individual fates of the guards themselves. In several documented cases, children of former guards only learned the full truth of their mother's wartime service decades later, sometimes through investigative journalism, sometimes through the renewed prosecutorial efforts of the 1990s that suddenly placed an elderly relative's name back in newspaper headlines after 50 years of silence. These revelations produced a range of documented reactions, from children who publicly grappled with the discovery through their own writing and advocacy work, using their family's history as a platform to support Holocaust education and remembrance efforts, to others who reportedly refused to accept the documented evidence, even when confronted with it directly. A pattern of denial that historians studying the children of perpetrators have noted extends well beyond the specific case of Ravensbruck guards into the broader phenomenon of how post-war German families processed, or failed to process, their relatives' involvement in the Nazi system. This intergenerational dimension underscores just how long the shadow of a place like Ravensbruck extends, rippling forward through families and communities for decades after the guards themselves had died, been executed, or simply faded into old age. Herta Ehlert's case, discussed earlier in this video, connects to a broader pattern worth examining in more detail: the systematic clemency and sentence reduction process that swept through West Germany during the 1950s as the young Federal Republic, eager to move past the immediate post-war period and increasingly focused on its integration into the Western Alliance system during the Cold War, adopted increasingly lenient policies toward convicted war criminals still serving sentences. This process saw numerous former camp guards, including several discussed throughout this video, released well before their original sentences would have concluded, a policy shift that reflected genuine legal and political debates occurring within West Germany at the time about the appropriate balance between accountability for Nazi-era crimes and the practical necessity of reintegrating a substantial portion of the population, including former camp personnel, back into ordinary civic and economic life. Critics of this clemency wave then and in the decades since have argued that it represented a premature and inadequate reckoning with the scale of what had happened at places like Ravensbruck, allowing convicted perpetrators to resume ordinary lives in some cases within a few short years of committing acts that had contributed directly to the deaths of thousands of women. Defenders of the policy, and there were genuine defenders even among some occupation officials at the time, pointed to the practical impossibility of permanently imprisoning the enormous number of Germans who had participated, in varying degrees, in the machinery of the Nazi camp system, and argued that a functioning post-war German democracy required some pathway toward reintegration, rather than permanent, blanket punishment. This tension between the demands of justice and the practical requirements of post-war reconstruction runs through the entire history of how Germany and the Allied powers handled the legacy of camps like Ravensbruck, and it remains a subject of active historical and ethical debate to this day. What lessons have historians drawn from the specific case of Ravensbruck's female guard population, distinct from the broader study of Nazi perpetrators generally? One recurring theme, emphasized across decades of scholarship on the camp, is the way Ravensbruck complicates any simple narrative that assigns violence and cruelty exclusively to men within the Nazi system. The camp's entire operational structure depended on women, recruited through ordinary employment channels, trained in a matter of weeks, and given genuine authority over the life and death of other women. and the historical record makes unmistakably clear that a significant number of these women exercised that authority with a level of brutality fully comparable to anything documented among male SS personnel at camps like Auschwitz or Dachau. This reality has forced historians to grapple directly with uncomfortable questions about gender and violence that earlier, more simplistic accounts of the Holocaust sometimes avoided, recognizing that the capacity for systematic cruelty within the machinery of genocide was never confined to one gender, and that the specific institutional conditions Ravensbruck created, isolation from broader civilian oversight, a steep hierarchy that rewarded escalating harshness with promotion, and a target population that Nazi ideology had already stripped of any claim to shared humanity, were sufficient to produce the same patterns of atrocity among a female guard workforce that had been documented among male perpetrators elsewhere in the system. Another theme that emerges clearly from tracing these individual cases is the fundamentally arbitrary nature of who among Ravensbruck's guard population ultimately faced justice and who did not. Proximity to surviving witnesses who happened to be captured or repatriated within the specific jurisdiction where a trial was eventually convened, the particular assignment a guard happened to hold within the camp's sprawling administrative structure, the sheer luck of whether documentation of specific incidents survived the war's chaos, all of these essentially arbitrary factors determined which women stood in the dock at Hameln facing a British tribunal and which women simply walked away and rebuilt ordinary lives within a few years of the camp's liberation. Binns, whose brutality was extreme but whose case also happened to generate an unusually rich body of specific, detailed survivor testimony, faced the gallows, while other guards whose conduct may well have been comparably severe, but whose specific acts were never as thoroughly documented or whose victims did not happen to survive to testify, escaped any formal judgment entirely. This arbitrariness is not a criticism of the individuals who worked tirelessly to bring the Hamburg trials to fruition under enormously difficult post-war conditions, but rather a sobering reflection on the inherent limitations of any justice system attempting to reckon with atrocity on the scale that Ravensbrück and the broader Nazi camp system ultimately produced. The story of Ravensbrück's female guards also intersects with the broader post-war history of how the Holocaust itself was understood and taught. And it is worth noting that for much of the immediate post-war period, the specific experiences of Ravensbrück's prisoners and the specific crimes of the women who guarded them received considerably less public attention than the more extensively documented history of Auschwitz and the other major extermination camps in occupied Poland. This relative obscurity reflected several factors, including Ravensbrück's location within the eventual East German state, which, as discussed earlier, shaped the camp's post-war memorial narrative in ways that emphasized different themes than those that dominated Western Holocaust education, as well as the simple fact that Ravensbrück, while it developed its own gas chamber and killing program in its final months, had operated for most of its history primarily as a forced labor camp, rather than a dedicated extermination facility from the outset, a distinction that, while it does nothing to diminish the genuine horror and lethality of conditions there, did shape how the camp was categorized and discussed within the broader post-war historical literature on the Holocaust for several decades. It has only been in more recent decades as historians have worked to develop a fuller and more comprehensive account of the entire Nazi camp system in all its variety, that Ravensbrück and the specific stories of the women who ran it have received the kind of sustained scholarly attention that this video has drawn on throughout. It is worth comparing Ravensbrück's post-war reckoning to that of other camps within the Nazi system to appreciate both what the Hamburg trials accomplished and where they fell short. At Auschwitz, the scale of the killing operation and the sheer number of Allied and later Polish investigations meant that a considerably larger cumulative number of perpetrators eventually faced some form of prosecution, spread across multiple trials conducted in different jurisdictions over several decades, from the immediate post-war Polish proceedings that condemned figures like Rudolf Höss and Maria Mandl, through the major Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of the 1960s that brought renewed international attention to camp crimes nearly 2 decades after the war's end, and on into the more recent trials of elderly former guards conducted in Germany during the 2010s, prosecutions made possible by evolving legal theories that eventually allowed courts to convict on the basis of complicity in the camp's operation as a whole, rather than requiring proof of specific individual killings. Ravensbruck never generated this same sustained, decades-long prosecutorial attention, partly because it lacked Auschwitz's singular symbolic status within Holocaust memory, and partly because, as discussed earlier, its location within East Germany limited the kind of ongoing investigative access that shaped the Auschwitz-related trials conducted in West Germany. This comparative neglect has itself become a subject of historical study, with scholars arguing that Ravensbruck's crimes, precisely because they were disproportionately committed by and against women, received less sustained public and legal attention across the post-war decades than crimes of comparable scale committed at camps more centrally associated with the male-dominated command structure of the broader SS and the wider Holocaust narrative as it developed in the public consciousness during the second half of the 20th century. The specific experience of Jewish prisoners at Ravensbrück adds a further dimension to this story, one that intersects directly with the question of guard culpability discussed throughout this video. While Ravensbrück held a diverse prisoner population, including political prisoners, Jehovah's Witnesses, so-called asocials, and women from occupied territories across Europe, Jewish prisoners faced a distinct and often more severe pattern of treatment within the camp's hierarchy, subject to additional discriminatory restrictions and disproportionately represented among those selected for the camp's killing program in its final months. Survivor testimony from Jewish prisoners at Ravensbrück describes guards, including several of the figures profiled in this video, who displayed a particular intensity of cruelty toward Jewish inmates specifically, reflecting the broader racial ideology that underpinned the entire Nazi camp system, even at a facility that, unlike Auschwitz, had not been established primarily as an instrument of the Holocaust's systematic extermination of European Jewry. This dimension of guard conduct, the specific targeting of prisoners on the basis of the same racial ideology that drove the broader genocide, factored into some of the tribunal's assessments of individual culpability, reinforcing the severity of sentences handed down to guards whose documented conduct showed this kind of targeted, ideologically motivated cruelty, rather than a more generalized pattern of harsh treatment applied relatively uniformly across the prisoner population. The physical conditions under which the Hamburg trials themselves were conducted deserve some attention, since they shaped both the practical scope of what could be prosecuted and the broader public perception of the proceedings at the time. The trials took place in the Curierhaus, a building in Hamburg that British authorities had requisitioned for the purpose, and the courtroom was, by all contemporary accounts, a place of considerable tension, packed with defendants who ranged from women in their early 20s, like Gräser and Falkenrath, to men in their 50s who had held senior command positions throughout the camp's operation. Survivors who had travelled from across Europe, some from as far as Poland and France, gave testimony in a proceeding that was, for many of them, their first opportunity to confront their former captors directly since the moment of liberation, and contemporary press accounts describe scenes of visible emotional distress on both sides, from witnesses who broke down while recounting specific atrocities, to defendants who, in a pattern that would become depressingly familiar across the broader landscape of post-war Nazi trials, frequently maintained composure, bordering on indifference throughout even the most damning testimony against them. The British prosecution team, working with translators to manage testimony given in Polish, French, and several other languages, faced the practical challenge of building legally sound cases from testimony given by traumatized witnesses describing events that had occurred, in some cases, years earlier, under conditions of such chaos and horror that precise dates, names, and sequences of events were understandably difficult for even the most reliable witnesses to reconstruct with total accuracy. A challenge that shaped defense strategies throughout the trials, as defense counsel frequently sought to exploit minor inconsistencies in witness accounts to undermine the broader credibility of testimony that, taken as a whole, painted an unmistakable and consistent picture of systematic brutality. The defense strategies employed across the various Ravensbruck trials followed recognizable patterns that would become common across the broader landscape of post-war Nazi war crimes prosecutions, and understanding these patterns helps explain both the outcomes we've traced throughout this video and the broader historical debate about how effectively these trials actually achieved justice. The most common defense, employed to varying degrees by nearly every defendant, centered on the claim of superior orders, the argument that guards had simply been following commands from their superiors and bore correspondingly reduced individual responsibility for carrying them out. British military tribunals, drawing on established principles of international law that had already been developed in the context of the larger Nuremberg proceedings, generally rejected this defense as an absolute shield against criminal liability, though they did sometimes weigh it as a mitigating factor in determining sentence severity. Part of the explanation for why guards like Ehlert and Bothy, whose defense teams argued they had acted under direct orders from more senior staff like Binns, received prison terms rather than execution. A second common defense strategy involved outright denial or minimization, defendants claiming that specific incidents described by survivor witnesses had either not occurred as described or had been carried out by other guards who happened to share similar physical descriptions, a defense that proved difficult to sustain given how frequently multiple independent witnesses corroborated specific accounts of the same guard's conduct. A third strategy, employed particularly by defendants connected to the medical apparatus like Salvaquart and Marshall, attempted to reframe clearly lethal actions, the administration of poison, the selection of patients for transport to gas chambers as legitimate medical judgments made under the confused and resource-strapped conditions of a collapsing wartime camp system, an argument the tribunal consistently rejected once presented with clear evidence that these actions had been undertaken specifically to kill rather than to treat. The role of documentary evidence, as distinct from survivor testimony, in securing convictions across the various Ravensbruck proceedings was considerably more limited than in some other post-war Nazi trials, particularly compared to the Nuremberg proceedings against senior leadership, where the meticulous German bureaucratic habit of documenting even the most horrific policies in writing provided prosecutors with an extraordinary paper trail. Ravensbruck's day-to-day brutality, by contrast, generated far less of this kind of documentary record, since individual acts of guard violence were rarely the subject of formal written orders or reports in the way that, for instance, the broader administrative machinery of deportation and mass killing at extermination camps further east had been documented through transport records, camp registers, and administrative correspondence. This meant that the Hamburg tribunals relied overwhelmingly on survivor testimony to establish guilt, a reliance that, while it produced convictions that most historians regard as fundamentally sound, given the weight and consistency of the accounts involved, also meant that the trial's outcomes were inherently shaped by which survivors happened to be available, willing, and able to testify, and by the specific guards those survivors happened to recognize and remember clearly enough to identify by name or by description years after their imprisonment had ended. Some limited documentary evidence did survive and prove useful, including partial camp records that had not been destroyed during the evacuation, transport lists connected to the killing program, and in a few cases photographic evidence. But the overall prosecutorial burden rested far more heavily on human memory and testimony than would be the case in many other Holocaust-related trials conducted in subsequent decades, once historians and prosecutors had access to a considerably fuller archival record. Consider also the fate of the physical camp itself in the years following liberation, since it offers its own kind of postscript to the story of the women who once ran it. Soviet forces, having liberated the camp on April 30th, 1945, used portions of the Ravensbruck site in the years immediately following the war for their own purposes, including as a detention facility during the early Soviet occupation period, an ironic continuation of the site's function as a place of confinement even after the original perpetrators had fled or been captured. Over subsequent decades, as East Germany developed the site's memorial function, portions of the original camp structure were preserved, restored, or in some cases reconstructed to serve an educational and commemorative purpose, while other sections were lost to decay, demolition, or repurposing before their historical significance was fully appreciated by the post-war East German state. Following German reunification, considerably more extensive resources were devoted to preserving and interpreting the site, and today the Ravensbruck Memorial stands as one of the most extensively documented former concentration camp sites in Germany. Its exhibitions drawing directly on decades of accumulated survivor testimony, trial records, and archival research, including much of the material this very video has drawn upon in reconstructing the individual stories of the guards who once patrolled its grounds. Visitors to the site today can walk through the preserved camp structures, view the reconstructed punishment bunker where Binns carried out so many of her documented beatings, and see exhibitions dedicated specifically to the post-war trials and their outcomes, ensuring that the story traced throughout this video remains accessible to new generations of visitors seeking to understand both the scale of what happened at Ravensbruck and the deeply imperfect process by which the post-war world attempted to hold its perpetrators accountable. The broader question of why ordinary people participate in extraordinary cruelty has occupied psychologists and historians for decades, and Ravensbruck's guard population has become one of the frequently cited case studies within that wider field of study, alongside more famous psychological research into obedience and institutional conformity conducted in the decades following the war. What distinguishes the Ravensbruck case from purely theoretical or laboratory-based studies of obedience is the sheer weight of documented, specific, sustained conduct involved. Not a single act performed under experimental pressure, but years of repeated voluntary participation in a system of escalating cruelty, conduct that guards like Binns and Gracie pursued with an intensity that went well beyond anything that could be explained by simple deference to authority or fear of punishment for non-compliance. Historians studying perpetrator psychology have noted that many Ravensbruck guards, when interviewed or when their conduct was later examined in detail, showed little evidence of having faced any serious personal risk had they simply performed their duties with less enthusiasm, suggesting that the extreme cruelty documented in cases like Binns's reflected something beyond mere institutional pressure, a genuine adaptation to and embrace of the camp's brutal culture that several scholars have connected to the broader psychological literature on how quickly ordinary individuals can internalize and even come to enjoy roles that grant them power over a dehumanized outgroup, particularly when that power is actively rewarded by promotion and peer recognition within the institution itself, exactly the incentive structure that Ravensbruck's SS command had built into its guard hierarchy from the camp's earliest days in 1939 through to its liberation 6 years later. As we bring this account to a close, it's worth stepping back to consider the sheer range of outcomes this video has traced. From Dorothea Binns swinging from a rope at Hameln Prison at 26 years old, to Johanna Langefeld dying peacefully in Augsburg in 1974, having never faced formal trial, to Herta Bothy living for more than 50 years after her release before a journalist finally tracked her down in the 1990s, to Louise Dance facing renewed prosecution in a reunified Germany half a century after the crimes she had originally been convicted of. There is no single, tidy narrative arc that captures what happened to the women who guarded Ravensbruck. Some faced the swiftest and most severe justice the post-war Allied tribunals could deliver. Others received sentences that, in hindsight, appear strikingly inadequate, given the scale of documented suffering they had caused. And a substantial number, likely the majority of the thousands of women who passed through the camp's guard service over its 6 years of operation, simply vanished into the vast, undocumented population of ordinary post-war German life, their crimes never formally examined by any court, their names never entered into any trial record, their victims left with no formal acknowledgement beyond whatever private memory and testimony they carried with them for the rest of their own lives. It is a deeply unsatisfying conclusion in many ways, one that resists the kind of clean moral resolution that we might wish history could offer. But it is also, historians consistently argue, the most honest account available of how the post-war world actually reckoned, imperfectly and incompletely, with the machinery of cruelty that operated behind Ravensbruck's gates. What remains constant across every single case this video has traced, whether the guard in question ultimately hanged, served a prison term, or disappeared entirely, is the testimony of the survivors themselves, the women who lived through what these guards inflicted, and who, in the years and decades after their liberation, made the difficult choice again and again to speak, to testify, to remember, ensuring that even the guards who escaped formal justice could never fully escape the historical record of what they had done. Their names, whether shouted in fear across a roll call square 80 years ago or read today from a memorial plaque at the site itself, remain part of the historical record precisely because survivors refused to let them be forgotten. That reckoning, imperfect and incomplete as it was, remains an essential part of how the world came to understand not just Ravensbruck, but the wider machinery of the Holocaust itself and the countless ordinary people who chose, again and again, to become instruments of its cruelty. Perhaps the most enduring lesson to draw from tracing these dozens of individual fates is not really about the guards themselves at all, but about what their stories collectively reveal regarding the fragility of the ordinary moral restraints most of us assume would prevent us from ever behaving as these women did. Restraints that Ravensbruck's institutional design methodically stripped away from a population of guards who, for the most part, arrived at the camp as unremarkable young women with no particular history of violence or cruelty. That is, in the end, the most unsettling and the most historically important takeaway this story offers, not a comfortable reassurance that such people were simply monsters set apart from the rest of humanity, but a far more disquieting reminder of how readily ordinary institutional structures, given sufficient isolation, ideology, and incentive, can produce monstrous conduct from entirely ordinary people. A lesson that historians and educators studying Ravensbruck have worked for decades to ensure is never forgotten. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic, make sure to check out our video on Maria Mandl, the notorious beast of Auschwitz, whose career began right here at Ravensbruck, as well as our video on what happened to the Waffen-SS after 1945 for more on how the broader machinery of Nazi Germany's enforcers met their post-war fates. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. See you in the next one.